If an application is vulnerable to cross-site scripting, one of the actions that attackers attempt to perform is capturing the username and password of the users and take over their accounts. In a successful scenario, if the victim is an admin user on the application, then exploiting cross-site scripting would allow an attacker to access the admin functions and data and fully compromise the application. During this video, we see this scenario in action. For the purpose of this exercise, we use a short cross-site scripting lab from Web Security Academy, and you can find the link to this lab in the video description. To solve this lab, we need to retrieve the username and password of a user and then use those credentials to log in into the victim account. Okay, let's go ahead and start the lab by clicking on Access the Lab. As we see, the application homepage contains several blog posts. We choose the first one and click on View Post. At the bottom of the page, there are a few comments from different users of the application and also a section for posting new comments. Based on the lab description, we already know that the comment field is vulnerable to stored cross-site scripting, so we proceed to exploit this vulnerability. Since our goal in this lab is to capture the user credentials, for the XSS payload, we need a JavaScript code that captures the victim username and password and send them via an HTTP request to an external domain that we control. JavaScript provides different methods to make HTTP requests to a web server to send or receive data, including XML HTTP request and fetch API. We will look at two sample payloads that can capture and send user credentials via HTTP request. The first payload is using XML HTTP request object, and the second one is using fetch API. Okay, now let's take a look at the first payload that is using XML HTTP request object. In this payload, two HTML input tags are defined for username and password fields. In the password input, there is onChange event attribute that will execute the capture function whenever the password input value is changed. In the capture function, two variables called user and pass are defined that get the value of username and password fields. Then an XML HTTP request object is created. The open function is used to initiate the HTTP request by defining the HTTP method, the URL of the external server, and the value of username and password as the URL parameters. And finally, the send function is used to make the HTTP request to the external server. For the second payload, we use Fetch API. Fetch is a native JavaScript API to make HTTP requests to send or receive data from a web server. Just like the previous payload, two input fields are defined for username and password. The value of onChange event attribute in password input tag is the Fetch API that will capture and send user credentials to the external server if the value of the password field is changed. The first parameter in Fetch API is the URL to the external server. The method parameter defines the HTTP request method, and the body parameter defines the body of HTTP post request, and it contains the value of the username and password field. Comparing these payloads, it is clear that Fetch is simpler and more flexible than XML HTTP request. So let's proceed with the second payload that is using Fetch API. However, I suggest that you also try the XML HTTP request payload for your own experiment. Okay, let's go ahead and put the XSS payload in the comment box. Then we fill out the name, email, and the website fields. There is one more step that we need to take before submitting our comment. We need to replace the domain in the XSS payload with the server that we can control. For the external server, we use Burp Collaborator. From the Burp menu, we choose Burp Collaborator client to open its window. To generate and copy a domain name, we click on Copy to Clipboard. We leave the Collaborator client window open and we go back to the web browser. In the comment box, we choose domain in our XSS payload and replace its value with the domain name that we just copied from Burp Collaborator. Now that all required information are provided, we can go ahead and post the comment. Now that our comment is submitted to the application, we need to wait until another user visits our comment containing the XSS payload. We go back to the Burp Collaborator window to see if there is any HTTP interaction from our XSS payload. We click on Poll Now to get the list of interactions. As we see, there are a few interactions, which means a victim user in the vulnerable application has visited our comment and our XSS payload has been executed in the context of his session. We choose the HTTP request and click on Request to Collaborator tab to inspect the request. Looking at the body of the request, we see a set of valid credentials separated by colon. These are the username and password of the victim user that has visited our comment. Let's copy these values, then close Collaborator window and go back to the browser. In the web browser, from the top right corner of the screen, we click on My Account, and as we see, the application redirects us to the login page. Let's fill out the username and password field with the credentials that we got from Burp Collaborator, and then click on Login. We see a message that we have solved the lab, and we can also see that we are logged in as an admin user on this application. In this video, we saw how an attacker could target application users, including the admin users, by exploiting cross-site scripting to capture user-valid credentials and take over their account. If you enjoyed watching this video, please give it a like and also be sure to subscribe to the channel as I upload new videos every week.